Germany had a new plan that they were soon to implement, and it may well bring neutral nations into the war as enemies. One of those nations was the United States, but Germany wasn't worried about them, and this week they tell you why. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, there was scattered action on the Western Front and the Italian Front. An Allied declaration from Rome promised to strive for the national rights of the many peoples of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German foreign minister offered German support of Mexico if Mexico went to war with the United States. That was done to deflect American energy in case the U.S. went to war against Germany, though that was not planned at the moment. And on January 22nd, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson said that while the U.S. would not have a voice in determining what terms of peace for the World War should be, they would have a voice in seeing whether those terms would be lasting as guaranteed. Things the U.S. would join in guaranteeing were A. It must be a peace without victory, that negotiations would be conducted between equals. B. Nations, whether great or small, must have equality of rights. C. Government must be based on the consent of the governed. For example, there must be a united, independent, autonomous Poland. D. The paths of the sea must be free, which is the most immediately and intensely practical question connected with the future fortunes of nations and of mankind. But those paths of the sea were not going to be free for very long. Germany was planning to reintroduce unrestricted submarine warfare, where all ships, neutral or otherwise, within the war zone were subject to being sunk on sight without warning. Now, everybody knew that this was going to be a big problem for the United States, and the drowning of American sailors and civilians might bring the U.S. into the war. But was Germany really worried about that possibility? Well, on January 23rd, Count Bernstorff, German ambassador in Washington, asked Berlin for $50,000 to influence members of Congress to remain neutral. Now that's over $1 million in today's money. But here's what the German High Command thought. Admiral Eduard von Kappel, the German Secretary of State for the Navy, told the Budgetary Committee of the Reichstag, they, the Americans, will not even come because our submarines will sink them. Thus, America from a military point of view means nothing, and again nothing, and for a third time, nothing. And in terms of the American Army, he kind of had a point. The American Army at this time numbered 107,641 men. It was only the 17th largest army in the world. The Allies, on just the Western Front, had 40 times that, 4 million men, and the Germans on the Western Front fielded 2.5 million men, 25 times the size of the entire American Army. And those guys had experience of modern war. The U.S. had no experience of large-scale operations since the American Civil War 50 years ago. The reserves, the National Guard, were larger, a whopping 132,000 men. But that was a part-time militia that was poorly trained. The U.S. did have one top-notch force, the Marines, but there were only 15,000 of them, and they were scattered around America's overseas possessions and interests. So really, the Germans wondered, why should we even worry about them at all? They had another neutral nation to worry about that seemed more important at the time, Greece. Now, the Greek government formally apologized this week to the Allies for Greek actions back on December 1st. This is very interesting, and I will tell you why. King Constantine, in spite of his familial connections to the Kaiser, always publicly affirmed his friendship with the Allies, but it seems he was playing a double game. Later this year, in Athens, will be discovered telegrams between Constantine and Queen Sophia on one hand, and the Kaiser, her brother, on the other. These illustrate a series of anti-Entente plots that have been going on for the past couple of months. On December 1st, a Greek force had attacked an Allied force in Athens, and this was why Greece was being forced to apologize now, right? Sophia wrote to her brother about the splendid victory the Greeks had achieved. In this telegram, she demands a strong German and Austrian offensive that would relieve Greece from foreign occupation. The Kaiser wrote back, urging Constantine to declare war on the Allies and actively fight the occupying Allied forces. They were not in a position to do this, though. Here's one telegram from Sophia to Wilhelm from January 10th, courtesy of the Story of the Great War. The shortage of ammunition and many other things compel us, unfortunately, to abstain from such offensive action. You can realize my position, how I suffer. Thank you warmly for your welcome words. May the infamous swine receive the punishment they deserve. I embrace you heartily, your exiled and unhappy sister who hopes for better times, Sophia. Constantine had written to the Kaiser a few days earlier. It is probable that a declaration of war might come before a mobilization might be effected. Probably the Entente desire to involve Greece in immediate war so as to destroy her before the German occupation could begin. Already, Greece is faced with a fresh Entente note demanding her complete disarmament. The transport of the whole artillery and war material to the Peloponnesus is being maintained by the pressure of the blockade. The government and people are resisting with constancy, enduring all sorts of privations, but the situation is growing worse from day to day. The Kaiser had been urging them to support and organize guerrilla bands in the Lake Ochrida region, and even back in December, a Greek diplomat in Berlin had written, "It is of the greatest importance to develop as quickly as possible the question of Karavites bands and matters relative thereto. Pray inform me with all speed what assistance in the way of munitions, money, and provisions you would want. The object of Karavites should be to cut the railroad from Monastir to Saloniki and harass Sarail's rear. One should not lose sight that even this unofficial action by the bands will powerfully help Greece." But this was a real big time for plans and preparations everywhere. Here's something I didn't have time to mention last week. French Commander-in-Chief Robert Nivelle had explained his plans for his big 1917 offensive. It would take place at Chemin des Dames. It would be a multi-pronged attack on the German line west of Reims, and Nivelle believed it would decide the war in under 48 hours. It would be a repeat, tactically, of what had worked so well in the final stages of the Battle of Verdun, and the death blow would come from a strike force of 27 French divisions of infantry and cavalry. Nivelle also promised that this would not turn into another endless Verdun or the Somme. He promised that if, impossibly, it failed to succeed within 2 days, he would call it off. He had persuaded British Prime Minister Lloyd George of the plan's merits, and on January 15th, Nivelle met with the British War Cabinet. He won them over as well, though there was the question of timing. Nivelle thought they could begin in February. Sir Douglas Haig suggested May, and they compromised, setting the date for April 1st. And here are some notes to end the week. In German East Africa, Jan Smuts relinquished his command of the British forces there and was succeeded by A.R. Hoskins. The British were currently advancing there, and on the 24th captured a German force of 289 men at Likuju. Forces of the Arab Revolt captured Al-Waj on the Red Sea on the 25th. The SS Laurentic was sunk by German mines off the Irish coast. Now that was a White Star ocean liner headed for Canada with a secret cargo of gold to buy war material. 354 of the 475 passengers' lives were lost, many of them freezing to death in the lifeboats in minus 13-degree weather. And that was the week. Wilson talking about peace plans, Nivelle making war plans, the Greeks talking about guerrilla war plans, the Germans dismissing the Americans, and scattered action in Arabia, Africa, and the Atlantic. It's true, you know, that the size of the American army was nothing compared to the mighty armies of the European powers. The US did have a large modern navy, but that might not help much in France. One thing the US did have that Germany may want to not ignore was an enormous modern arms industry, entirely built over the past 2 years with European money to supply the war effort. and a huge population that could conceivably become soldiers in the millions. But that would take time, and Germany did not plan on wasting time. They were about to take an unbelievably nasty war and make it a lot nastier. If you'd like to find out more about the situation in the United States during the first few years of the war, you can click right here for our special episode about that. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Philip Kunze von Bischofshausen. Yep. Support us on Patreon to make this show even better, and do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.